So I'm really excited that I get to join Haley today. I'll be the moderator, so I'm going to be monitoring the chat for questions, and I'll also be letting Haley know, hey, we've got some time left, or do you want to take some questions? But if you can, please mute your speakers. We'd love to see you if you want your camera on, but I understand I've had a long day of meetings, so if you need it off, that's fine too. We are going to record this session, so I wanted to make sure I prefaced it with that, because we do want to share these conference sessions on our YouTube channel after the conference is over. So just please be mindful that this will be recorded, although the chat won't be saved. So if you do have questions, the conference app has a discussion question section that you can actually ask Haley directly any questions you might have, or if Haley has some resources she wants to share, be sure to go and check out her session description within the app itself. And last thing, I'm going to remind you all at the end, but please, please, please don't forget to fill out our session feedback forms. These are really helpful in terms of how we plan conferences and target different conference themes and areas of interest based on what you'll share. So with that being said, Haley, please feel free to take it away.
Thank you so much for having me today. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Haley Moss. I am from Miami, Florida. I am an attorney, I am an author, I am an artist, I am an advocate, and I am autistic. So that is kind of the big thing when we talk about people on the autism spectrum. There's always this question of, why are you the one to talk to us about this? And personal experience and the professional often go together for me. So as an attorney, I'm really passionate about the Americans with Disabilities Act, disability policy, and workplace issues. I think it's one of those fascinating things that crops up as we talk about folks transitioning to adulthood and getting older. I have a book coming out in the next couple of months that I'm really excited about neurodiversity for lawyers and other professionals, so that we could be better at accommodating folks in the workplace and working with clients who might also be neurodivergent. So that's a really cool thing that I'm working on. And I also do a lot of stuff, and I'm writing about young autistic people getting ready to become adults and transitioning to independent living, whatever that's supposed to mean, because everyone has a different definition of independence. So I'm proud and excited to welcome you all to today's session. Today is with autism with a job, the case for neurodiversity in the workplace. And I'm going to get started with a little bit of housekeeping, and then we're going to get the show on the road here. So fear not, we're in for a fun afternoon together, and I'm looking forward to sharing and hope that everyone comes away with something new or something that feels actionable for each of us to work with as we go forward. So I like to start by talking about accessibility. We talked a little bit about whether you can be on mute, whether you can have your cameras on, all that good stuff. So I am someone who is here to be as inclusive as possible, make all the information possible as accessible to you, whatever that looks like. So that's to say that no one person can grant or gatekeep access. That's something we create together. So if you need to have your camera off because you are like me and looking at yourself makes you feel extra distracted, so I actually minimize that feature while I present, because it makes me focus more on looking at myself than anything else, or looking at all of you, then that's okay. If you need to take a break and come back later, that's okay. If you need to move, or you need to get a snack, or you need to do anything that you need to do, or you just feel overwhelmed, or you think I'm talking too fast and you want me to slow down, please let me know. No judgment. If you want a copy of the slides, I have copies that you can follow along with. I can provide them to you individually after the fact. I know that presentations have a lot of information. And for our folks who are blind or have visual impairments, I do use alt text on images, and everything here should be friendly to a screen reader. So for those of you who aren't familiar, screen readers are very cool technology that folks with visual impairments use to access visual content and other stuff on computers and the internet. It is a very cool thing, and probably you might have learned something just now if you're not familiar with that technology. So without further ado, let's get the show on the road, and we're going to start back to basics. So it is April, which means that it's Autism Acceptance Month, or Awareness Month if you're more old school. And of course, one of the biggest questions that we get to start with, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this, but just kind of as a nice little overview, is what is autism? And I get asked this question a lot from students or people who just don't know, or they have this very specific picture of what they think autism is. So the best definition that I was able to put together from both like the DSM, and also the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, so coming from this more acceptance-based framework, is that autism is a complex neurological condition and a developmental disability that's characterized by a spectrum of differences in social communication and interaction, meaning we communicate differently than you may, or we have difficulties with neurotypical type social skills, heightened sensory processing and experiences. This looks different for every person. For me, this looks like I'm really bad at things that are loud and crowded, and I really can't stand jazz music because the saxophone just overwhelms me every single time without failure. Intense passions or interests. You ask me or many other autistic people what we're excited about or what we care about, you will hear a lot about it, and it's absolutely beautiful and very exciting. And also repetitive behaviors. So for those of you who do spend time with autistic students or students with disabilities, you might have heard this called stimming. That is what it basically self-stimulatory behaviors that make us feel calm or that we do because they bring us joy. It really depends on the person. My hands move a lot when I'm very excited. I also will fidget with things if I'm nervous, things like that. And when we're thinking about how many people are on the autism spectrum, we have estimates of about 1 in 54 children and about 5.4 million adults in. So there's a lot of people. We have about 2.2% of the population. And because this is a question before we really dive in that you're going to probably hear as a note on language, you probably have noticed that I say autistic people and not people with autism. I know that this is something that a lot of professionals in particular probably are a little bit curious about. I use identity first language because that's how I describe myself, and a lot of adults on the spectrum do the same thing. So we see autism as not something to be ashamed of and something that's a part of our identity rather than something that we are with. I know that seeing the person first is something that we are taught when we're in school, and I want to be respectful of that. But above all, please respect the choices of whoever you're describing. So some people will prefer that language and others like me will use identity language. Just kind of a little note there, because I know this comes up almost every single time I talk about autism is somebody's going to ask me, why are you saying autistic people? So just kind of something to keep in mind. And that brings us to this idea of neurodiversity. So a lot of us who spend time in the disability sphere and disability rights, that we all notice that there's this neurodiversity movement and this concept of neurodiversity being floated around. And you see a lot of corporate recruitment programs that are starting to use this slogan of neurodiversity at work. And people go, Haley, that all sounds wonderful. What does that mean? And the best definition to help explain this is that neurodiversity is a concept where neurological differences are to be recognized and respected as any other human variation. So kind of like how we have biodiversity and we have a diversity of species, we also have a diversity of brains. And people who have labels and diagnoses that fall under neurodiversity or might be considered neurodivergent people are people who are diagnosed with things like autism, ADHD, learning disabilities, Tourette syndrome, intellectual disabilities, and depending on how the person identifies, even mental health disabilities. So I do know people who have conditions such as like bipolar or schizophrenia who will also identify as neurodivergent, and others who do not. Again, a lot of this comes down to how somebody identifies, but people with these specific brain profiles are often considered neurodivergent, while people whose brains work inside the norm, so to speak, so probably most of us in this room, are considered neurotypical. And that's not a bad thing. When we have neurotypicals and neurodivergent people in the same place, that is what neurodiversity is all about. So we have a diverse group of brains and individuals on our planet, and we are better for that. And that brings us to the workplace. So we hear a lot about this idea of neurodiversity at work. It's something that we see going on with a lot of major corporations, especially in science and engineering and technology and math. So we see it with places like Microsoft. We see it places at like Ernst & Young. We see Goldman Sachs. We see all these really big companies that are going behind this neurodiversity and autism at work playbook and ideas, and they're actively trying to recruit autistic people and others with disabilities into the workforce. And you might be thinking, why? Other than the fact that there is low employment in these communities, all of these companies have found major benefits from it. So at technology company SAP, a fix created by neurodiverse teams saved them nearly $40 million. That's a lot of money. That is more money than I will probably ever see in my life. 28% higher revenues than companies that do not employ people with disabilities. So basically, if we're hiring people with disabilities, we see more money. Companies get more money. They have higher profits. Their shareholders are happy. Everybody kind of wins there. We also have favorable public opinion. So we're all from Florida and we all might shop at Publix or at least familiar with Publix. Every time I go to Publix, there is a cashier with Down syndrome. I see him every time I go. I've lived in the same apartment and gone to the same Publix for the last 6 years of my life. And I always see this cashier, and every time I see him, it makes me so happy. And it just makes me feel good about supporting a business in my community that also supports people with disabilities and people, especially with intellectual and developmental disabilities like myself. And of course, we all benefit from diversity. So we see this not even just in neurodiversity, but we see this with all other forms of diversity and inclusion, is we benefit from working with people who are different than we are. We learn different perspectives, we have different creative problem solving, we have all sorts of good stuff going on. And the same is true when we work with all kinds of minds, that we need all kinds of minds to kind of solve the problems of today and tomorrow and looking forward. And who knows what we can do together when we are a team in that matter. But despite all of these wonderful things, we have an employment disparity, especially when it comes to people on the autism spectrum. Is what we see, despite these, we have this high unemployment rate, and that we have traditional hiring practices that are biased against autistic candidates. We have miscommunication and misinterpretation going on. So neurotypicals will often misinterpret the way that we communicate and move throughout the world. This happens to me a lot in both my personal and professional life. That even the way that our bodies move and the things that we do are seen in certain ways. So we talked a lot about stimming and things like that. So think about your friends with ADHD or your autistic friends, and what you'll see is things like fidgeting, and you'll just think it's very distracting, or that their bodies are moving a lot and you'll think it's distracting, when really it's how they're regulating attention or calming down anxiety or whatever it may be. So please try to have a different perspective in understanding this. And of course, there's things like eye contact. So in the case of eye contact, particularly, for me, it is very difficult sometimes to look somebody straight in the eye as we're taught. And if I look somewhere else, you might think I'm not paying attention, when really, if I look straight at you, I might only be able to focus on you and not what you're saying. There's also gaps in employment that you see. So people who might bounce from job to job, people who are unemployed or self-employed for long periods of time. You also have people who fear disclosing if they have autism or another disability or neurodiverse condition. And also they're afraid of discrimination. And as an attorney, I could tell you that's a very real fear, and that the Americans with Disabilities Act exists for good reason. And finally, coming from a hiring perspective and employers, that there's this fear of the unknown. What's it going to be like working with neurodivergent people? What's it going to be like working with someone who I'm not sure how to accommodate? What is there to worry about and think about here? So there's a lot of stuff that we're often thinking about, and that comes into play in these situations. And that kind of brings us to the really big question, especially as we prepare young people for the workforce, is when is the right time to disclose? Is people always like to ask this question. Is they go, when do we say that we have autism, or when do we say that we have ADHD? If we ever will say that. And it really depends on the person. So for me, I disclose almost immediately, because you can't Google my name without finding out. I'm very open about my autism. It's a choice that I made when I was a teenager. It's a choice that I continue to live with into my mid to late 20s at this point. And some people, depending on the job, the person, and their comfort level, might disclose in a cover letter. They might share in an interview when they have offers, if they need an accommodation. But the legal answer to this question is you don't have to disclose until you need an accommodation. So when you're requesting accommodations, you have to disclose and mention that you need an accommodation because of a disability. So that is kind of the short answer if you're really looking for the what do I do in this specific situation. And of course, all of us have a role to play in preparing young people to talk about disclosing. So there's some really cool resources that I want to point you to, and I'll be sure to upload these into the app as well, is that you can promote self-advocacy by discussing self-advocacy and disclosure as a team. So whether you're a parent, whether you're a teacher, whether you're in VR, whatever role you're playing, or you're in college working with young folks on the spectrum, whatever you're doing, there's some really cool resources. A lot of them come in partnership with or from the Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy, that is ODEP. And ODEP is really cool. So there's this type of like workbook. There's all sorts of cool stuff I'd love to point you to from them, which also includes things like this resource that I want to share with everyone too. And I, again, will make sure to link this as well. Is there's kind of this little PDF of explaining like when to disclose, if there's a need to disclose, when you do it and how to. And what's really cool is it does kind of walk through the pros and cons of when you make that choice of what can happen, what can be a setback, and also how the best way to disclose is depending on who you are as an individual and what you feel comfortable with. So big fan of this one and really excited to share that with you as well. And of course, in this whole disclosure conversation, I want to point everyone to another ODEP resource. This is called the Job Accommodation Network. And the Job Accommodation Network is really awesome. They have information for all types of disabilities, not just autism. And they can talk about all sorts of different things about how to accommodate people at the interview stage, when to disclose, what kind of knowledge to have, and even just promoting things for both the applicants and for the employers alike and the employees once they're there. So lots of cool information all around to keep everybody nice and empowered. And of course, because a lot of us are not people on the spectrum ourselves, we have all sorts of really cool stuff that we can do to help prepare people for interviews and think about why things are happening. So interviewers have very specific sets of things that they look for and will judge people on. If the company is using things like artificial intelligence, they're literally just judging your facial expressions, scanning your resume for keywords, and they're even just watching your tone of voice and other things and making decisions that way before it reaches a human. I've done a lot of research on this. I wrote a law review article about it. I'm very geeky when it comes to weird Title I things, including AI. So other human reviewers and interviewers are sometimes looking for things like, not only is this person very skilled, but is this someone I'd like to socialize with if I'm stuck at an airport for 5 hours? That is something that I've learned in time. It's called the layover test. And I never thought that would be a thing that I'd be judged on, but apparently it is. The more you know. And finally, we have this idea as well as that behaviors can be misinterpreted as that someone's lying to you or that you're distracted. So if I'm looking the other way, you're going to think maybe I'm hiding something or I'm lying to you, when really I'm just trying to focus on what you're saying and I'm trying to manage my own feelings, and maybe someone doesn't feel confident and they need to do something like that. The other thing that's really difficult for folks on the spectrum, especially those of us who like literal language, is that open-ended questions can be really difficult to gauge. If you asked me to tell me about yourself, and I didn't realize that it was in a work setting, for instance, I might give you a very different answer than you asking me about my work history. So try to be specific when you can. I think it clears up any ambiguity, because if you ask me to tell me about myself and not just in this situation, you might hear me talk about some other things, such as the fact that I love games, or that I love hanging out with my friends and family, and that I have some pets, and that I also am really excited that Taylor Swift released a new album. Like, that's stuff you might not want to hear about in a job interview, but that is something that I would think it as kind of some random facts for a tell me about yourself. I do know that if someone in an interview situation asks me that question, I know I'm supposed to kind of give an overview of what I'm looking for, where I came from, things like that. Something else that can be very helpful as well is skills-based interviewing. So even just preparing people to do maybe a sample of the task at hand, rather than just asking a bunch of questions where somebody might flub, or they might have a different processing speed, or might have difficulty interpreting those types of open-ended questions. So those are some of the different things we could do in order to prepare someone, or things that we could be thinking about to make our practices a little bit more inclusive. And here's some ideas that the Job Accommodation Network, which I mentioned to you before, has come up with. Some of these I've heard from Jan and also from the folks at the Stanford Neurodiversity Project, is that you can request fewer interviewers as an accommodation. So if you're very overwhelmed by like a panel, or not knowing who to look at, or maybe there's too many things going on, you can request to have fewer people. Especially in today's day and age, you can also request that a first interview be over the phone or over Zoom perhaps, or maybe not have the video component, or maybe not have to come in person until it's a final round interview, for instance, or that you want to meet the team. you can actually request that stuff as a reasonable accommodation. Stanford also recommends requesting a copy of the questions in advance. And what Stanford makes their neurodivergent job seekers do is also provide the employers with questions in advance. So there's no real surprises on either end. And this especially helps folks who have difficulties processing or being quick to think on their feet. However, this is a request that might be denied if part of the job description is thinking on your feet. If you were supposed to be a quick thinker, this might not be as feasible. And some people are really great at certain times of days. You can also request that. So I guess some of us just aren't morning people. I know I'm not a morning person, but this is never something I would have thought to do. But Jan suggested it, and I thought it was very cool. So the more you know, once again, and this is just some of the stuff that we could do in preparing and having ideas to help make the process go a little smoother. For those of you who are curious about some of these accommodations, they are leveling the playing field for neurodivergent and autistic people. They're not necessarily making it easier for them to get jobs. It's already hard enough. The system is biased enough as is. It's really difficult. And we're just trying to level the playing field. Just like those of you who wear glasses, you are doing it so you can see. We're doing this just so we can even get our foot in the door. Really want to make that clear because I get asked a lot about this with accommodations is people go, aren't you just trying to make life easier? No, we're just trying to have the same opportunity as any other non-disabled person and anyone else who wants that same position. To that matter, when we talked about disclosure and accommodations, you might have heard me or others describe myself as openly autistic, and people go, what does that mean? For me, it's not having to hide or mask. It is being the freedom to be exactly who I am. So I am pretty much the same as I would be in any other situation with all of you today. I'm trying to be as real as I can. I know that if that's not for you, if that's not for a company, if that's not for anyone else, then that is kind of how it goes. And I would rather know now rather than later. So for me, it's been great to just be able to live the best life that I can as authentically as possible. But keep in mind, not everyone has this freedom or chooses to do so. And no matter whether someone is open, whether they're only telling supervisors and close family, or whether they just tell someone that they work with in school, that is totally valid, and you should respect that as well. I have no judgment whatsoever for anyone who is not open, doesn't know they're autistic, or just hasn't quite hit that level of acceptance and pride. So we talked a little bit about the idea of accommodations and accessibility. We talked about that a little bit. And the thing with employers is they don't want to always grant them. They think that accommodations cause this thing in legal world known as undue hardship. For those of you who don't know, undue hardship is a fancy way of saying that it's either impossible, incredibly difficult, or just really expensive. So kind of to bust that myth right away about most things causing undue hardship, that our friends at JAN let us know that most disability related accommodations have a one-time cost of $500 or less. Given all the benefits that we've seen from disability inclusion and neurodiversity at work, that's a really small investment given the payoffs that you could possibly get. And then people go, what do accommodations look like? So on the slide, you see somebody rocking out happily with their headphones. That was kind of me when I was working in an office setting. So for me, my past office had very bright fluorescent lights. It was very overwhelming for me to kind of take in. And it would give me headaches. It was very bright, all sorts of stuff. So I was allowed to wear headphones at work. This was no cost to my previous employer. And as long as whatever I might have had going through them or whatever noise was being canceled, it didn't matter as long as I was able to hear the phone. If my supervisor needed me or a client called, that was the rule. And that was totally okay. And everyone goes, how do we go about getting accommodations? And something to understand is accommodations are an interactive process and a conversation between two or more people. So you might be working with someone in HR, you might be working with a direct supervisor, depending on the size of the company or organization that you work in. Lots to keep in mind, I know, but we got this and we're getting through it together. Which brings us to this other thing that we need to do while our young people and folks with disabilities are still in education and still working on different things as well, is we have to empower people to be able to ask for accommodations. And that brings us to this shift towards self-advocacy. And self-advocacy is both a movement and a set of skills. So there's all sorts of really cool self-advocacy resources nationwide and here in Florida. And for those of you who want to know kind of as a skill set, it empowers people with disabilities to make choices that affect our daily lives and allow us to be a little bit more independent. And as a personal and political philosophy, self-advocacy is a movement for and by people with disabilities, making their own decisions, speaking for themselves and others, and taking control over their own lives. I think this is a very cool concept. You've probably heard a lot of people with disabilities referred to as self-advocates, but this is stuff that all of us do, but it's really important that we empower our people with disabilities to be able to do these things, because so often other people try to speak for us when they should be speaking with us and making sure to listen to what we have to say, because at the end of the day, it's our own lives and our decisions too. Most of us probably are not self-advocates in this case, that we are supporting people with disabilities and autistic people. We might be parents, we might be educators, we might be professionals working with them in voc rehab or some other capacity, or we might even be the employer ourselves. So we're able to actually encourage self-advocacy in literally every setting that we're in. When we're talking about really little kids, it could be even allowing them to help make a decision of what you're eating for dinner and actually honoring the choice that they make. We want to show that self-advocacy skills matter and that when we do it, it's not going unheard. So it could be as simple as somebody we know saying that they don't feel comfortable and that we honor their boundaries. It could be learning somebody's needs if they need to take a break, or in school, it could just be applying to everyone. So something that I saw that was really cool is a few years ago, there was a hashtag that went around Twitter called "I wish my teacher knew." And I believe it was a fourth grade teacher had all of her students complete this sentence on a note card, and they all wrote something that would surprise the teacher. Is they'd write something like, "I wish she knew that I didn't have pencils because my family can't afford new supplies," or "I wish that she knew my favorite thing in the world is X, Y, and Z." It's all of these different things that gave a more concrete person of what the person's needs were, what their background and where they were coming from. Is that we could be a little bit more empathetic, we could be better listeners, and even with younger self-advocates. So I think about myself when I was in elementary school. Once I realized I was autistic and my parents explained it to me, I was invited to come along to meetings at the beginning of the school year with new teachers. And I was able to partake in adding my own goals for the year. So I went to private school and we had 504 plans. And under 504, I was able to advocate for when I wanted to make new friends or what I was hoping to accomplish that year. And it would actually get written into the plan. The plan was about me, and I became a part of that team. I was a part of Team Haley. And often we think of those IEP 504 teams as not necessarily including the student themselves. So being able to have my voice at that table and being listened to really set the stage as a younger self-advocate. So this is not just for our young adults or our adults or teenagers who are getting ready to go to college or enter the workforce. This is an all ages and stages thing that we can start and eventually get ready for that workforce moment. And of course, we can all look at disclosure at work and also requesting accommodations as a form of self-advocacy. So we're able to frame accommodations again as an interactive process and a conversation. So not everyone wants to disclose at every given moment. And something that I learned while I was in law school, because another law student taught me this, is there's a power phrase for neurodiversity as she describes it. She describes it as just completing the blanks of "I work best when." And that way, you can be able to share more about your work style, you can share more about what you need, but you don't have to specifically name your disability if you don't feel comfortable with that. And I would do this sometimes with new people.
Well, listen to our mouth.
Oh, okay. Is with new people, I'd say, "I work best when you give me clear instructions." And that would be a way to signal that this is what I need and this is how we can make this happen together. We also have to decide who needs to know about disability or who we're disclosing to. So sometimes it might just be to a direct supervisor, while other times it might not be or may be appropriate for all of the colleagues to know. I didn't love when every single person knew all the ins and outs of my disability, because it would make me feel uncomfortable, or they'd think I was getting special treatment, or maybe they all needed to know so they didn't think I was receiving special treatment. It really depended. And this is a highly individual thing. So everyone has different reasons why they disclose, who needs to know. And if someone discloses to you, it might also be smart to know who you can tell, who else needs to know, and who else does know. So not everyone is super open. I am, but that's not the norm. Or maybe it's not, maybe it is. It really depends on where you are and who you're working with. And again, we need to also, as self-advocates, understand the pros and cons of these decisions. We talked a little bit about that earlier. And finally, when we are good self-advocates, not only can we help create solutions to feel welcomed and included in our workplace, but we can also have a say in drafting policies. So the very first place that I interned when I was in law school had a policy that the office was a fragrance-free place. I did not quite understand this as a nice, young, fresh-faced intern. And then I learned we had a fragrance-free policy because of the advocacy of a past intern with a disability, because she had allergies and she also got migraines. And it meant a lot to think, oh my God, this was really cool. Someone advocated for this thing because it could be a sensory issue, it could be an allergy issue, it could be a processing issue, that this can have so many different effects on so many different people. So just the fact that someone advocated not to have perfume and cologne in our workplace was really powerful. And it meant that together, not only can we just come up with solutions, but we can come up with things that benefit everybody. Is it turned out that that allergy was not just for her in that policy, it also benefited people who did have sensory difficulties and easily became overwhelmed or had different allergies or just had or would get migraines or something else as well. So you never know. And that's kind of the beauty of disability policy and design and accessible design and whatnot, is it's not just benefiting one group of people, it's benefiting all of us. Think about closed captions. We have them here today. If you want them, they don't just benefit people with hearing impairments or deaf people, they benefit all of us. We all probably use them in some way, shape, or form when we're watching TV or the like. So that brings me to a little bit more of a discussion on the future of neurodiversity at work. What does this all look like when we put things together? And to me, that future looks really, really like something that I'm hopeful for, that we have neurodiverse leadership, we have more collaboration, we have an inclusive culture, and of course, we're aligning people to their strengths all across the spectrum, no matter what it might be. So when I talk about neurodiverse leadership, I mean that we're going to eventually have neurodivergent people at the top. So something that happens a lot is we see that people want careers. They don't just want jobs. Is a lot of companies and things will think they could just check off a box when they hire autistic and neurodivergent people, but we want to be able to grow. We want to stay somewhere long term. We want to evolve with the rest of you. That's something that I always wanted to, is providing these opportunities for growth. So actually mentoring us, making sure to invest in our professional development. This is something that I know that I struggle with still today, and something that I always wanted was better mentorship, because I felt like a lot of times there'd be a box being checked or something. It's like, once we got you in the door, we're done. That's just the beginning. We want the same things that everybody else wants. I promise it's not that special. We want to be treated with respect. We want to be able to grow. We want to be happy in the jobs and careers that we have. And something really cool is, I think that in the future, so I've mentioned earlier that I'm in my 20s, is I would love to see this newer generation of young people eventually become part of leadership and executive teams and decision makers going forward. And I also like to imagine what that looks like when we have these neurodiverse teams or panels making these decisions about hiring and interviewing. Will it be a more inclusive process? Will we see greater empathy and understanding? Will we maybe have a different solution? And that makes me really excited about the future, is that we can do that, and that we might be able to do that if only we take the initiative now to invest in our future in that way. I also think that we can have a greater culture of acceptance and inclusion. So what does that look like? Something that I learned last semester. So last semester, I taught a college class, and I learned it starts from the top down with openness and vulnerability. So I taught a class about autism through the psych department at Taylor University in Indiana. And I had 15 very wonderful students, mostly juniors and seniors. And what we did is, the first day I shared about myself, why I was their professor that semester, and what we were going to be talking about. And I was very open about the fact I'm autistic. It's an autism studies class, of course. If we're talking about disability rights and policy and all sorts of understanding of neurodiversity type stuff, I wanted them to know where I was coming from. And being open with them opened the floodgates in our class. Our virtual classroom was a very open-minded place. Students would email me, they would share their own personal stories. When we had to go around and introduce ourselves the first day, I was surprised what people were willing to share after I shared about myself. Is a lot of them were sharing if they were neurodivergent themselves. They were sharing things that they might not have shared in another classroom, because they perceived somebody who was in a position of authority or power of being able to do that, and that meant it was safe. So when we have people who are in high level things sharing about their mental health, about their families, about whatever it is that makes them different or marginalized in some way, it sets off a ripple effect. So people who are new don't have to make all the effort to build that culture. The culture will already be there. If you were somewhere bigger, you might have employee resource or interest groups. I've seen this at a lot of the bigger companies that I've worked with and have known people who are a part of. So there might be a disability group or a neurodiversity group. It's a really great way to get support from your colleagues or to meet new people that might have something similar in common with you. Something else we can do is actually align people to their strengths. So there's a lot of preconceptions and stereotypes of autism related disabilities. It really is frustrating every time that somebody thinks I'm a computer genius. Again, I went to law school. I am not a computer genius. So actually matching people to things that they're good at goes really far, and people will be happier that way too. We need to communicate.
Haley, I just
openly.
wanted to let you know we have about 7 or 8 minutes. Just in case you saw my note.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So we're almost at the end. I promise everyone we're almost at question time, and we have open communication. So something that we can do there is that we can do better at communicating with each other about accommodations, how things are going. And something else really cool is that we have a lot of trainings on autism. I know that this is probably one of many, if not the first that you've gone to. And something really cool is that we're focusing from just having autistic people getting onboarded and having them being taught how to interact with everybody else to everybody else learning how to interact with us and be more understanding and empathetic. And the best is like moments like today, where you have autistic people with firsthand experience and professional experience leading the conversation. Is that so often people talk for us. They don't allow us to have the mic, or they don't speak alongside us. Instead, we're often the ones who are sidelined in our own conversation, which can be really frustrating in its own right too. So that's a great way to signal that you're inclusive, is that you can have people who do identify with that group as being the leaders to help explain things about that group as well. And of course, don't put this on people who are new or make one person the designated representative of people like me. That's something that I've learned from other diverse groups and diversity conversations. It could be a lot of exhausting labor, not part of the job that you signed up to do. So of course, only let people do this if they're willing to, if they consent, or if it's their initiative, whatever it might be. You don't want to overwhelm anyone either. So in our focusing on the strengths, there's something I wanted to draw your attention to. I have this really cool graphic from the University of Leeds in partnership with Autism Speaks here, and they gave some really cool things about neurodiversity and autism, of things that we're really good at, especially at work. So things like attention to detail, a deep focus, observational skills, memory, visual skills, expertise, our different approaches, that we're creative and resilient and we're accepting of others. And of course, that we have integrity as honest, loyal, and committed people. So again, this will be available to you. I really do enjoy sharing things like this because it's how do we look at disability? How do we look at autism? Do we look at it as a checklist of deficits, or are we actually going to look at the things that make us all wonderfully human and good at what we do? I hope that it's the latter. I hope that we actually pay attention to what people are good at. And each of us have a role to play in this conversation, that we all can continue this. So hopefully today you might have just learned something new, or maybe you're just starting this. It's okay if you feel uncomfortable having these conversations for the first time. The most important thing is that you learn from that feeling and that you continue to grow. So we all have a place in this, and I look forward to having a more neurodiverse society and more accepting place for each of us. So with that in mind, I know we have a little bit of time, and I'm happy to take a couple of questions. So thank you all for listening, and let's get started.
This is Tara, just a reminder that we are recording, and we will have this shared in the conference app and then also on the Florida DCDT YouTube channel. Please go ahead, and if you have questions for Haley, you can type them in the chat. But if our question session ends before you get yours answered, you can also share questions in the event app itself that Haley will have access to in case we run out of time. So as we're getting ready to share some questions, don't forget to please fill out the survey. It's actually in the conference app itself. I'm going to screen share really quickly so you know where to find it. So this is our app, and it's right down here. post-school outcome session feedback. That's one of the targets for this. Please, please, please share how awesome Haley is in here so we can give her some credit. This is some great information. I know I was taking notes. So thank you, Haley, so much for this. And let's jump into some questions.
Absolutely. And if anyone is feeling shy in the chat or doesn't want to show, you're always welcome to send me a message or an email or whatever it might be. I know that people are usually kind of nervous or kind of shy, and I just want to be a good resource. So if that's you, fear not, I got you.
I'm seeing lots of comments. I have one from Rita. Is the PowerPoint going to be in the Event Mobi app? I didn't see it in there, but Haley, if you would like,
I could put it there if you
would. Yeah, whatever you're more comfortable with. That's a great question.
I'm just curious how widely shared that means it's going to be, because I try to keep my PowerPoints as internal and limited to participants as possible.
I think that's more of a you question. I think whatever you're comfortable with.
Okay. So I'm always happy to send it out.
Sure.
I just like getting, I actually do get to give these a lot, and it always is kind of frustrating when people will steal your slides and things like that. So
Absolutely.
I try to make sure, I don't want to disrespect anyone, but I'm happy to provide those to you. I just am assuming they're not going to get too widely distributed beyond just people here. And there's a really great question in here that I saw just popped up.
Yes, I was about to say, I'm seeing it. Do you have recommendations about when schools should begin teaching students with autism to self-advocate? That's such a good question.
That's a great question. So I think it's very different for every student and every child, but I think that self-advocacy skills can be taught at each grade level or with each age and stage and what someone's level of understanding is, regardless of if they know about their disability. So I didn't know until I was 9. But my parents knew when I was 3. It's just when it was appropriate to have that conversation with me. But self-advocacy growing up meant even just having a voice at those discussions about what to have for dinner, for instance, or picking a restaurant, or even just deciding on an activity at school. Like there's all sorts of different ways we can incorporate self-advocacy and teaching that you don't have to be in high school or college to have this grand understanding of disability rights and your rights under the law. You don't have to have that level of knowledge or understanding of that. And I think that's something that gets lost a lot. You don't even have to understand that you have a disability to be a self-advocate. I think it's just understanding that you are a person who is making choices. Your choices matter. They deserve to be respected, and that you have a role to play in your own story. So it could be being when I was 9, getting to go to the equivalent of an IEP meeting. I love telling parents, usually if their kids are old enough to, and not even if they're old enough, but if they're able to understand what's going on, or they have that self-awareness that they should be active participants in their educational process. And that includes going to those meetings. So there's so many different ways that we can incorporate this. There's no perfect age. Every child is different. Everyone's cognitive abilities are different. Everyone's level of understanding is different, whether they're advocating with their voice or whether it's with a tablet, whatever it might be. Please encourage that. There are many different ways to be verbal.
I think we have just another minute. We can answer, I think, one more question. You answered a 504 while in school. As a VR counselor, what would you suggest in making myself available to attend these meetings? Ooh, great question.
That's really good. So I think with these meetings, it's who's on that team. If you're part of that team, and if the family and the student or child or whoever it may be thinks that's a good fit, I think that's a great idea, because I think that the more people that are involved, that it's usually a good thing, especially because these teams are usually pretty big. But I think first and foremost, it should be up to the student or young person or whoever it may be to decide if they're able to, who is there. And if not, I believe it does end up falling on the family. So I know, like, I didn't have VR, but I know that if it were up to me, that might have been a decision I would have made, especially for folks who might not just be going straight to college, or maybe they are, or maybe they're after college. I think it really depends on the person. So I think that we have to really take that individual approach, because again, and I've heard this said many, many times, if you've met one person on the spectrum, you've met one person on the spectrum. Don't just go by what you're hearing from me, because my experience is just my own. I am in some places just the messenger, others I am just the expert on myself. I also just happen to know a little bit about the ADA because I actually am an attorney and I enjoy that stuff. and I love policy, and I can geek out about it all day long.
And I think on that note, we do have to get ready for another session that's getting ready to start. But I just wanted to say thank you again, Haley, for sharing such awesome information. And please make sure you fill out your feedback form, and you can connect with Haley through any of the conference opportunities to keep this conversation going. Thank you so much, Haley.
Thank you.
And I think, where did she go? Tracy, I'm not sure what you need from us to kind of end the session or how that works for the recording, but please, please, please. This was awesome. Haley, this was so helpful.
Thank you,
I'm
Haley.
so glad.